you have embarrassing stories you don't want to mention. We'd like you to start by giving us your name and spell your last name for us.
Okay. My name is Robert C. Sabin, S-A-B-I-N.
Okay, and you go by Bob.
I go by Bob.
Okay. Tell us where you were and what you were doing when World War II began for the United States.
Okay, I was enrolled in the University of Oregon, and I was in our ROTC program for 3 years there in the infantry. And we were allowed to, I applied for advanced ROTC, and we were allowed to continue 1 year after the war had started, so that eventually I was called to active duty on the 13th of June in 1943. And I was part of a group of about 54 ROTC students, mostly infantry, but some were armored. And we were assigned to Camp Roberts, California, and stayed there for about 4 months basic training, after which we were supposed to go to Fort Benning for Officer Candidate School, but there was no room. And so they sent us back to the University of Oregon and put us into an ASTP unit for engineering. And so I got 2 terms of college education here in ASTP. And while we were there, we were still waiting for Officer Candidate School. The Air Corps put out a call for candidates for officer training, pilot, bombardier, navigator, and so forth. And so about half of our group of 54 decided to take the chance, and so we volunteered and were sent to Santa Ana, California for classification. And we stayed there a month, and when we finished all our classification, some of us flunked and some of us didn't, but the Air Corps decided that the casualty rates had declined remarkably in that time, and so they said, we don't need you folks anymore. And so they sent us back to where we came from. So our whole group came back to Eugene, to the ASTP unit, and then by that time things started to change, and so a group of us reported to Fort Benning, Georgia in June of '44. And we finished our officer training and infantry training there at Fort Benning, Georgia. On the 4th of October, I graduated, and I was assigned, along with a friend of mine, to the 10th Mountain Division. And I went to Company I, the 85th Mountain Infantry Regiment at Camp Swift, Texas. And so we stayed there in training with a big assignment of mules that came from Kansas, I believe, to train as a light infantry division. And then we had a new general assigned to us in October of '44, who was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner, George P. Hayes. We trained under him until about the mid-December, and then the unit started packing up to go overseas. And we didn't know where we were going. Went to Camp Henry, Fort Patrick Henry in Virginia, and from there aboarded a troop ship, the SS West Point, and 5,000 of us sailed across the Atlantic Ocean through Gibraltar and landed in Naples, Italy in just the beginning of January.
Well, tell us a little bit about the voyage over, what that was like, and what the conditions were on the ship. Did you encounter any difficulties with it?
Okay, the voyage over was, as I said, on the USS West Point, which was a converted cruise ship. It held 2,000 cruise passengers, and they refitted it so it would carry 5,000 soldiers. So we had a large group of us on there, and the enlisted men were packed about 6 high on their hammocks that they, we were not escorted at all because the ship was so fast, and we zigzagged across the Atlantic. We ran into a couple of storms, and that was not very pleasant, and particularly when a lot of men got sick way down. And I was an officer, so we were assigned to a particular area, but we had to check on our men and so on. And that part was quite disagreeable. But other than that, we survived, and so we landed in Naples, Italy, and disembarked there.
Now, before we go into the Italian experience, take you back just a little bit. I'd like you to tell us why it is you have got involved in ROTC.
Well, at the university at that time, as with many schools, I got involved in ROTC because we had to. The first 2 years were mandatory for all male students, and they may have had other branches. I think it mainly was infantry, however. So there were obviously a large group of us then. And following that, or as that went along, of course the war started in 1941, and we had the opportunity. I would like to have a commission if I could be taken into the service, and so I volunteered or applied for advanced ROTC, and thankfully was accepted along with a number of my friends. And so we stayed for our 3rd year and took the base of the particular training you had. If we'd stayed through for 4 years, we would have presumably gotten a commission after some field service. And so I just thought, well, for education purposes and for if you had to have a job in the Army, I'd just soon be an officer, and so I did.
Okay. All right, let's talk about Naples and first impressions of Italy.
Well, we sailed into the harbor of Naples, which was full of sunken ships and really a devastated area, but it was a major port in Italy, and we sailed in there and disembarked, and they decided to send most of us, well, part of us went by rail, and a number of us were put on LCI, landing craft infantry ships, and sent up to Leghorn, Italy, or Livorno, as I called it. And we were disembarked up there, and they had a big staging ground there on some huge estate of some sort. And so we were billeted in tents, and we reorganized and got set up so that we could go to the front lines. And the front lines at that time were basically along the Apennine mountain chain from the east coast of Italy clear out to Leghorn. And so we staged there for probably a couple of weeks, and then we were assigned positions on the front lines, and subsequently we moved up there, and each unit was assigned a particular sector. And then everything was in a stable condition at that time. The Allies had not been able to push farther northward, and the Germans were dug in, and so they were just in a holding pattern. There was a lot of artillery shelling and patrols, and that's what the activity was. And it's a beautiful country, but under those conditions, I had the distinction of being billeted in the Puccini's estate or something in a little town up there near the front line. So anyway, but we trained, just basically stayed, and we had our first casualty was someone who was killed on a ski patrol. The unit was made up of skiers and mountain men from all over the nation. I was not one of them, however, and so we used the mountain skills in that interim, and then preparatory to the 18th of February when we made our first attack.
That is unusual. Most of the men in the 10th Mountain Division not only were they volunteers for that division,
Correct.
but they were highly skilled in some sort of outdoorsy kind of thing. So you're kind of a unique.
I have no explanation. I never climbed a mountain, and I never wore a ski. But they sent me there anyway. Maybe I was from Oregon. Maybe that counted. I don't know. So anyway.
Well, now, we're all kind of young, dumb, and indestructible when we go to combat.
Oh, yeah.
And then usually something happens very quickly in the first few days that we're exposed that causes us to realize we are mortal after all, and this could really be dangerous. What happened to you that would...
Well, our unit, 3rd Battalion, sort of at the last minute, was switched over to be the main battalion, along with the 2nd Battalion, that attacked the Mount Belvedere. That was a 3,600 high feet peak with a ridge line of a number of other little peaks and ridges and so forth. It had some snow on it, but it wasn't extremely heavy. And so on the 18th of February, our general decided since the Army had tried to capture that mountain 3 other times in the daytime and had not succeeded, the Germans pushed them back, that we would attack at night. So we attacked at 11 o'clock that night and started crawling up the side of that mountain. It was heavily mined, and there was barbed wire also across the side of the mountain. And so we made our way up very silently, no ammunition in our weapons at all. They didn't want anybody firing a weapon. There was to be a sneak attack, and it turned out very successfully. On my way up, I had an engineer, a young engineer from engineer platoon, who went with us to help clear the mines if we could locate them. And I dragged I felt something, and the Germans had what you called stock mines. They were up on a little post, and it was a canister filled with concrete and nails, I don't know what, all kinds of metal, and it was explosive inside. So if you tripped that thing, it blasted, and you'd be gone. Thankfully, I didn't trip it. I sweated it out. But then we crawled right up the mountain. I was at the head of my platoon, and another platoon on my right. And we just crawled up a little ravine up the mountain. And when I got up to the top, we were again instructed not to do any firing until we were fired upon. And we did receive some mortar shells and some other things. And I was lightly wounded on the right thigh. And so that immobilized me. But we did reach the top, and my company did capture, along with the company, the L company on our right, captured the mountain. And they went on and continued fighting for the next few days. But I evacuated in daylight, sometime after daylight, down to an aid station, and then they sent me back to a general hospital in Pistoia. And I stayed there for a month to recuperate, and recuperated successfully, and then returned to my unit. Our captain, company commander, was shot between the eyes by a sniper at the top of that hill, and he was up somewhat beyond me. And we received several casualties in that whole process. Very sobering event, and I thank God that I got out of it okay. And as it turned out, they had some severe fighting following my evacuation, and who knows what might have happened if I'd stayed on through that.
So how was the German opposition during the initial portion of the attack?
As I say, we did a surprise attack, and the Germans were totally surprised. In fact, the night before, the 86th Regiment had captured a locale called Riva Ridge, which was off to the south of Mount Belvedere and looked over and somewhat down on Mount Belvedere. And the Germans had artillery, and they didn't have much air power, so that was a benefit for us. But at any rate, we were, as I say, successful. They went on and captured, next 15 days or so, a whole string of other small mountains, and the whole object was to straighten out the line in the Apennine Mountains preparatory to attacking into the Po Valley. And they needed this high Mount Belvedere was really a thorn in our side, you might say, because all of our transportation ran around down below there, and the Germans had full visibility. We were fortunate, and the German did not have any Air Force. So our P-47s and P-40s and our attack planes had command of the skies. So that was very, very beneficial.
So the unit had probably pretty much changed by the time you got back.
I was gone for about 25 days, something like that. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but we had several wounded, and 3 of my medic was killed. So several were killed in that first initial attack, and then beyond that, several were wounded. So right, there were changes. I was, however, assigned back to my platoon when I joined them back behind the lines, getting ready to make the attack into the Po Valley. And we lost, actually, 3 officers were killed out of my company. out of 6 officers. And so it was a dangerous business. The troops that we were against were a mixed bag, I have to say. There were some veteran SS-type troopers who sort of controlled everything, but their manpower situation was rather poor. And so they had a number of young kids, they had old men as a part of that, but they were well dug in and they had terrific artillery, very accurate. So they were worthy opponents, and our division was highly commended for that particular campaign, and so.
Tell me what it's like as a platoon leader trying to control an attack in the middle of the night, up a mountain.
Well, jokingly, we called platoon leaders lead scouts. But at any rate, we just snaked our way up the mountain, and basically it was almost hand touch. I mean, you could tell where the man ahead of you was, and they followed up in kind of a single line up our particular sector. And when I got up to the top and I got wounded, then I didn't know where they were, and I don't think they knew where I was, and some of them were surprised I was wounded. But at any rate, no one was particularly near me at the time, and so that was sort of simple, you might say, in keeping control and for that brief period of time. And then I didn't experience the other, so I was very fortunate to have that wound.
Well, let's talk about the attack into the Po Valley then.
Okay. Well, following their final capture of all the peaks and so on, and we took over control of all of that territory, the Germans had to retreat and went back to positions farther back, and on the preparatory to April 14th, we had to resupply our men, had to reorganize and get ready for the attack, and we had an awful lot of planning of which sector we were in, and our particular company was the leftmost of the division, meaning west, and my platoon was the western platoon of the company there. And so we had quite a bit of preparation, and then as I said, we had air control of the air. So we were scheduled on the 12th of April to make the attack, but the weather was bad and the planes couldn't fly and hit their targets. And they were part of the preparation bombing and so forth of the enemy positions. And so, incidentally, Franklin Roosevelt died that day, and that didn't particularly interrupt with us, but by the 14th, things had cleared up. And so we were scheduled, we made our attack on the 14th about 9 o'clock in the morning after a tremendous artillery barrages and mortar barrages and the airplanes bombing their positions. But the Germans were very good soldiers. Their army was well trained, though they were decimated to a degree. And they had excellent fortifications, and they withstood an awful lot. You'd think that all the bombs that dropped, they'd all be dead, but they maintained a strong fighting force, and we had to really fight hard for the next 20 days. Actually, probably the first 3 days, we broke through their line, and they started retreating. And then our units one would go, and then they'd leapfrog, and another would take its place, and so on, and we just pressed on forward continuously for a total of about 22 days, and ended up at Lake Garda on the Swiss border in that time. And so it was a tough fight during that intense period of 4 or 5 days, actually, and then the rest of it, we were pretty much chasing them as they were retreating, but they were fighting small units, we were fighting and so on.
Can you give us an idea of the fighting from a personal perspective, what you can see, how much?
Well, incidentally, Bob Dole, who is the senator from Kansas and vice president or presidential candidate, was in my company. He was a second platoon leader on my right side, and I was on his left. And his unit advanced a little farther than we did initially, and in the process he ran into some intense fire and was very severely wounded. And it took him 3 years to recuperate after he was hauled back to the States. But my unit was sort of pinned down. They had machine gun fire going across on a kind of little ridge in front of us. And so we were held back because of that. And we were stalemated for a little while. But on our right flank, one of the other units, and I think it was the 86th Regiment, one of their units, was able to break through at a particular point. And when that occurred, after a few hours, then we started funneling through that point of breakthrough. And our unit received fire, we received mortar fire, and some of our men were killed with mines because everything was mined. But we didn't, our platoon at that point did not get involved in any hand-to-hand combat, or we did not find a German machine gun nest and try to wipe it out. We actually were sort of stymied, and then we went around and we continued on with the rest of the unit, and actually did not. Some of our units were involved in combat, and again, mortar fire they were very accurate with their mortar fire, so we had casualties due to that. But we had several men killed from the company in that first 3 or 4 days. And but I have to say, I didn't end up looking a German in the eye and sticking him with a bayonet. None of that particular happened. But we were all part of this movement, and depended which unit you were in and what the circumstance was of what happened. But again, our company, when the thing was all over, I was told by my company clerk who kept track of those things that we received the most killed and the most wounded of any rifle company in the division. And I don't know the full statistics other than what we did. We lost actually 4 officers killed by the time it was all over.
How do you cope as an officer with the loss of these men that you've trained and care about? And can you put that into words?
Well, one thing I preface it by saying I wasn't with the unit very long, so I hadn't had time from October of 44 to January or February of 45. But I love my men, and they seem to have a good regard for me. I was particularly saddened by the loss of a company commander who was a big ex-football player from Kansas, and Captain Luther. My 2 fellow officers I knew in that span of time. Bob Dole I only knew for about 3 weeks, and I have, very little recollection of him because we were 3 weeks in getting ready to go, and then he was over there and I was over there, and then he was gone. I also lost my medic, and he was shot straight. He had a Red Cross on his helmet, and a sniper up on the mountain shot him while he was attending to a wounded man. And so those things, had several men killed, but again, I didn't know them extremely well, but still, we were all in the same thing together, and it was hard.
There are often strong feelings associated with the enemy.
Yes.
Especially in the Pacific.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about the Germans? You've already talked about their ability
right.
as soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about them then and now?
Well, in a general sense, I strongly agreed with the Allies' action. I mean, the Germans and the Italians did terrible things until they were finally conquered. And so in that sense, I felt they were kind of a mortal enemy. They were an enemy, quote, of the free world, and that I felt very strongly about the cause we were in, and the fact that I needed to help fight them and overcome them. So, but in a personal sense, I didn't really have a personal hatred because I had really no contact. We did after Mount Belvedere. As I made my way back to the aid station, we ran across a lot of dead Germans, and some of them were extremely young, this sort of thing. But again, other than that, what you say, the general cause feeling that we were doing the right thing for our country and the world, that was about it.
We were talking earlier about tanks and
Yes.
your thoughts about them. Can you tell us how you felt about American tanks?
Well, I can't even remember were there T-34s or what they were.
Shermans.
Shermans, I think, were the ones we had, yeah. And they supported us with the direct fire on, it's kind of like the artillery. They were part of that. And as they could, on the roads and available areas where they could, they followed us right along. And a matter of fact, when we started to rout the Germans, after we broke through the line, often we were right behind and beside the tanks as they pushed on through a particular objective. So my personal feeling was great to have them. They really, and I didn't have a sense, particularly, that the fact that they were good targets and were subject to artillery and that sort of thing. I didn't really have a personal sense of any animosity or anxiety about that particularly. We were just darn glad to have them.
You guys are right on the tanks. I've seen pictures of infantry riding on tanks.
I can't recall that I was never personally that close to a tank, but I know our different units would be using them as a part of an attack mode, and it could very well be as we went on farther that some men, I didn't personally experience it. Yeah.
Okay. I want to take a minute and talk about the terrain in Italy and how that helped or hampered your operation.
Well, the North Apennine Mountains are quite rugged. As I say, there was some snow and ice on them, but not heavily that way. When we got there, now a lot of fighting had happened prior to our coming. Like I said, Mount Belvedere was attacked 3 times. The artillery actually on their forward slopes had bombarded them so heavily, and the air power had bombarded them, that there were hardly a tree left on Mount Belvedere when we made the attack. They were just, it was so badly. But the mountains were steep, and we had some, when the 86th Regiment made an attack on Riva Ridge, they did have to climb with their whatever pitons and all that stuff, and just inch their way up a vertical wall of rock for about 800 feet. And when they got to the top, there was snow and ice up there. So they encountered that. But if it had been heavy snow, that would have been a different situation. But anyway, the mountains were rugged, and the roads that went around between them were narrow, and so there weren't many ways that you could just advance forward. You just had to climb up over them and go down them and up over and down the next one, that sort of thing. But when I look back at what they did at Monte Cassino down in the middle of Italy for several months fighting in the mud and that sort of, we didn't have mud, and we were very fortunate in those regards. And it was, as I say, tough terrain to get through.
Okay. You've already pretty much kind of summarized your experience and motivation, but now you're looking back from 60 years. How do you feel about this experience and what it did for you or to you?
Well, I often said that the Army made a man out of me. Being a commissioned officer, going through the training that was involved in that, and serving as an officer in my company, and earning the respect of my men. At least that's I was given that impression, and I felt that way I felt good about them, and they felt good about me. And I also, I really take great pride in having served my country in that way, you know. And when people start downgrading our country, or criticizing things so much, or if corporations are taking great advantage of opportunities that the World War II gave them. Now that's kind of a negative comment, but in a sense, I felt that we did a lot for the world, and I was really proud to be a soldier. I really was.
What sort of things do you think you do as an officer to earn the men's respect? What is being an officer, what does that require?
Well, by nature, I'm a caring person, so I was concerned about every man. I kept a certain distance because that's part of the deal, but I feel I have a sense of humor, and I used it quite a bit. You know, if I can make something funny out of a situation that maybe was not very funny, well, there was a value to that. And I know my training officer in Fort Benning, Georgia, commented on that. He says, "You got a damn good sense of humor." At any rate, so I feel that, and I try to be honest and forthright and good moral values and that sort of thing, and try to reflect that. I'm a member of the Presbyterian Church, and I had those values that I carried with me, and I had from my mother particularly. I got a conscientiousness about doing things. Whenever I worked, she says, "Bobby, do the best you can," kind of thing, and I carried that with me, and I tried to do that, and I think probably that was it. Because we've had about 6 reunions of our unit, the Mountain Association, and I've attended about 5 of those, and it's been wonderful to get back with the men I was with, and they felt the same. So
you think that it's valuable for the guys that were a part of this to talk and to get these kind of things that they went through out in the open?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was very pleased that you called. And I haven't really talked a whole lot. And matter of fact, when you come back, you don't, I didn't have horrific experiences like so many men, but I still didn't end up talking very much about them, you know. So anytime I can get on a soapbox and talk, that's fine.
So following the war, you elected to remain in the reserves, you said?
Well, they gave me the opportunity when I was just getting ready to take off that you could sign on for the Army Reserve, and you know, you'd keep your commission, and you could go into reserve training and so forth. And not dreaming that anything bad, we already fought the war to end all wars, that's going to happen. Well, I went ahead and signed up, and so how did I know Harry Truman was going to get mad at the Koreans and send us all over there? And they did call a tremendous amount of reservists for the Korean War. Yeah, so, yeah. But it had some values in the sense I could go on, and 20 years I could get a pension, you know, out of it, that sort of thing. I didn't end up doing that, but that was a factor in it. And I didn't see any drawbacks to it, so.
Well, let's talk for a minute about that call-up of reservists for the Korean War.
Oh, yeah, well.
How you got caught in that, how you felt about that?
Well, in my situation, I was participating in what I called a sleepy unit, a reserve unit. We had minimum amount of drills and that sort of thing, but we did carry on a program, and it was infantry stuff. And so that was okay until I got into education. I was a teacher for a while in Roseburg and a vice principal, and then I got ideas I wanted to be a superintendent. I came to Coburg here for 3 years as a superintendent, and I was jumping vice principal to superintendent was a pretty big jump, and I was kind of overwhelmed with the job. So that convinced me finally that I just couldn't take on I said to myself I couldn't do the reserve and that too, and I was working on a doctoral program as well. So I dropped out of the reserve.
Okay. So were you activated and sent to Korea? Or?
Yes, I didn't follow that up. I was actually called on about March of 1951. That's after the war had been going about 6 or 7 months. I had a good friend, Chuck Roth, who's on that list I gave you, who was called up in September of 1950. Now, he was in the reserves, but he was on a list in Washington, D.C. somewhere. Now, I was at least in a unit, and so on. So I lost my train of thought for a minute.
You're getting called up for Korea.
Yeah, okay. So they called me in March, and I was teaching school at that time at the junior high school in Roseburg, and so I asked for a delay until June to finish my contract. They agreed to that, and so I was called in June of 1951. And I went to Fort Ord, California, and I was on the Training Methods Committee in Fort Ord for about 2 months. And it didn't help me much with infantry combat, so pretty soon they gave me the orders to FECOM. They wanted me to go to FECOM in the Far East Command, and so a fellow officer had applied for a refresher course at Fort Benning, and they granted it to him, and so I said, I ought to do something like that, learn what the new weapons are, and so I did the same thing. So I spent a month in Fort Benning, Georgia, in November and December, and then I went to active duty. They flew me over on a nice commercial airliner over to Japan in January of '52, and I was there for 9 months on the front lines with the 7th Infantry Division, A Company, and I was a rifle platoon leader, and we had shelling quite a bit, and we did squad-sized patrols mainly, and the line was stabilized almost like it is at the present time with the DMZ. So anyway,
What are your impressions of Korea? And,
well,
training?
I'll hark back to Italy a minute. One thing that struck me so hard in Italy was the abject poverty of the people and the destruction of all of their buildings and infrastructure and so on. When I went to Korea, I ran into the same thing. I went to Busan, I went to Japan, then went over to Busan and to a staging area sort of there, and outside the wires, outside our compound, here were all these little kids with cans in their hands begging for food, so on. So that was one impression that I had of Korea. Now, the war had gone on quite a bit, and the units had gone up the peninsula and down the peninsula, so there was a lot of destruction there. It was very mountainous where we were, and it was bitter cold when I went in January, and units were in reserve, and so we were in bunkers and dressed as warmly as we could, but we had hot food and all those things, and things were stabilized, so I had a good break in that regard. And then later on in the spring, things thawed up, and we had some shelling. I was on a little promontory out in the middle of a valley in front of our main line of resistance, and our company was out there, and we were shelled with 72 rounds of 120 millimeter cannon from the Chinese over behind a huge mountain up in front of us, and not a man was killed or hurt. But they blew up a lot of bunkers, a lot of trenches, and so on. So that was the most difficult thing we had. We did also have one small firefight where a group of patrol of theirs, Chinese, came over and shot mortar rounds over on one of my positions and so on. But the country was very rugged, and we had Korean civilians helping us. We had our officers had a boy who helped take care of us when we were back in training and that sort of thing. And the people, little contact I had with them was cordial, and we really love Kim, our boy, that sort of thing. So, and I really sympathized with the men who had been there early on when they were fighting back and forth and back and forth, and before Incheon, and they finally drove them up to about where they are now. So there was a lot of tough fighting there. My friend Chuck Roth went clear to the Yalu River and back with his unit. So anyway.
You know, you talked about the moral purpose of World War
Right.
II. Do you feel the same way about Korea?
You know, a lot of people didn't. They thought it was a forgotten war, and I think that was true to an extent. But I did not. I felt that if Truman and the United Nations had not taken the stand that they did, that there would not be a South Korea today. I think that Chinese backed up the North Koreans. We'd whipped the North Koreans initially, but when the Chinese got in and started sending their troops in, then it became the difficult war that it was. And they just had to fight so long, and then everybody realized nobody was going anywhere, and they had to settle it, and they did. But I felt, again, a sense of moral right in doing what we did there. And I think it did have an impact on the advance of communism, you know. And I didn't like it. I didn't appreciate being called up, you know, with very little notice and that sort of thing. But I felt okay about it, especially when I came out okay, you know.
Did you see a difference between the soldiers from World War II and those that you were with in Korea?
Oh, I think so, in the sense that in World War II, all of us were in it together. I mean, the draft and everything was applied, and we had, how many, 16 million armed forces people. And so that was a huge cause. And in the Korean War, again, I felt okay about that. I didn't answer your question, I think.
Well, yeah, I just wondered how you felt about
Okay,
the quality
I'm sorry.
of the soldiers and their commitment
right.
to the cause as well.
In contrast to that, we had regular Army over there and regular Marines and so forth, but we had a tremendous number of volunteers, of I think, National Guard and reservists, and that was different. And a lot of the people, you know, had a kind of a bad feeling about that, because it seemed like they were keeping the regular units back and kind of bringing the reserves in to do a heavy amount of the work. So, but I joined a regular Army division, the 7th Division, and it was kind of a mixture. We had West Point people with us too, you know. So, but it was a different mix and a different situation.
Well, the Korean War is also kind of a watershed with the desegregation of the military.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I don't know that before that I had too many feelings about it. You kind of took things as they were, but I agreed with what Truman tried to do and what he did. I've since had some comments from people who said that even though they desegregated, that there was an awful lot of subrosus, or whatever you want to call it, segregation still went on afterwards. But I felt that was the thing to do. And I felt badly, for example, in Italy, we had a 92nd Division. They were all black. They had white officers, and it was considered a kind of a poor outfit. But I thought that it was bad to do that. Now the Japanese, the Nisis, a small group of them really used their race to an advantage, and they fought heroically. But the 92nd Division sadly did not have a reputation as being a strong fighting outfit.
Did you ever run into the 442?
No, I never did, really. They were in our general vicinity, and I tell you, I had nothing but the most respect for those people. coming out of their bad situation and then turning to defend the country. It was a wonderful story.
It's kind of hard to believe, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, right. But they walk around with pride, you know. I mean, they really proved something. And I felt so badly, personally, about what we did to the Japanese in World War II, you know. That was not a bright mark on our... The chances of our being invaded by Japan were rather minimal, I thought. And so, that's a side comment.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. I think that's a fascinating story and one that we haven't really explored too much in our country.
Yeah.
We're just kind of now openly talking about that.
Yes, and...
So you must have been at the university when they did the evacuation of Japanese. Did you see that, understand what was going on?
Well, you know, I don't even remember that. I don't know where I was. We're thinking of other things, I guess, but I don't really have a recollection of that. You knew about it, and I guess you kind of shrugged and said, well, this is a terrible war, and the Japanese are terrible folks, and that who knows what might happen. But these people all came from Japan, and they were being good citizens, and but unfortunately there was a lot of prejudice, you know. So I'm not proud of that chapter. Yeah.
A lot of people are. I refer to it as not a particularly shining moment in American history.
And I didn't know any particular people personally, you know. But just knowing what happened, that's...
It's odd, isn't it? I mean, the amount of time, the passage of time makes a difference. At the time, a lot of people just shrugged and said, well, it's a terrible war.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And now everybody looks back and says, that was a terribly illegal and un-American thing to do.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'm glad we've progressed as we have, and I'm sorry it's been so slow. And then we've gone all through the civil rights problems in the 60s and so on. So, and then, of course, we had Vietnam War, and that was another big divisive thing, too. People, I have a kind of a funny view about that, maybe, because I know a lot of people who hated that war, who thought it was terribly wrong, and so forth. And I was personally not involved at my age and so forth. But looking at the political situation, I felt, given all the terrible thing, you know, all the disruption and the arguments about it and so on, that what was done there had an impact, again, on the spread of communism. And if we had not fought those terrible years and tried to blunt the Russians and Chinese and who all were helping the North Vietnamese, that we might have had the whole Southeast Asia under communist rule. Now, a lot of people don't agree with that, but I personally felt, and so I felt to that degree it was a just war. And you, having been in it, may not feel the same. Because
we'll talk about that after.
A lot of terrible things happened there.
It was a bad situation. It easily could have been the wrong war in the wrong place, and for the wrong reasons. But the guys that I went with, and me myself, it was a question of your country said you needed to do
right.
this.
That's
and
right.
So we went. And
that's right.
So for good, bad, or indifferent,
yeah,
I can feel good about it because I went and did what I was asked.
Yes, right.
So, do you have any other comments then about Korea? Were you there when the armistice occurred?
No, I was fortunate in one regard in that I was considered to be on the front lines the full time I was there. When I went, my regiment was in reserve, but they were prepared to fight if they had to. So we were counted as being in a combat situation. And then later our unit moved up to the front lines and we were exposed out and some of this thing I mentioned. And so I was only there 9 months. And if I had been back in the reserves and some things like that, my tour would have been longer. But so that all worked, and as I say, I came out okay. you know, I didn't get killed or maimed or hurt.
Do you have an opinion of the Chinese as soldiers as you do the Germans?
Well, I have really hardly have any basis other than they are tenacious fighters. And I know we had a sad incident. I was asked as a company I was acting as a company commander at the time, to identify the best squad that I had in my company. And the regiment wanted to put together a task force of, I'm not sure how many, but they had squads from several companies. And they put these elite good soldiers, and I did what I was asked. I gave them my best squad. And they made an attack on a position that was virtually impossible to take. It had an exposed field way out in front of it, and the Chinese just murdered them. And I really felt badly about that, but they were tough fighters, and they disregard their lives. They'd charge, and that was just fanatic kind of people. And but I had no personal contact at all, and I didn't really like their artillery when they shelled us for that one Sunday afternoon, and that sort of thing. And I, in a sense, I regret maybe MacArthur going as far as he did, and the point of he wanted to go into China, and in a sense provoking this thing. And the Chinese, no way were they going to let us, take over that area. So anyway, I don't like them for that reason, certainly. I guess I understand their political view or something like that, and I wouldn't want to fight them today either, I don't think.
Jumping back to Italy real fast, I forgot to ask you what you thought of the way the fighting was handled there, of Clark and the generals and their planning.
Yeah. Well, my feeling is, when we went in kind of late in the game, but my feeling was that the Fifth Army was well commanded. They had good generals, good tacticians, and so forth. And I respected the British Eighth Army, which was off to our right flank, and both of those had been there for a long time. Some of them slogged all the way up down in Sicily. And their units had. Of course, the soldiers changed, but and particularly I was extremely proud of my commanding general, General Hayes, and he got many, many accolades from what the division did under his command over there. There was, matter of fact, other units, and I said, what the hell, we fought this war for 2 years before you guys got here. You were here for 5 months, and here you get all this hoopla about it. But again, we were an elite unit. We had a lot of college-trained kids, skiers, mountaineers, and they had to get recommendations to get into the unit and that sort of thing. So but I really felt good about the command and the way things were done. Had no second guessing there.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's it.
That it?
Unless you have something you just want to say for posterity's sake.
Well, I think the only thing I would close again, which is something I said earlier, and that is that looking back over my experience, and I had a career in education, and incidentally, Italy taught me that I wanted to go into education. I saw the abject poverty and everything. I said, this war is terrible. And if there's any way we can do something about it through the field of education, which I in a sense, naively felt maybe, but I said, I'm going to get into that kind of a field, which I did, and I got into social studies and social science, and I got into administration, and I felt proud about that. But I'd not back down to anybody on the service that I was able to give my country. And I really look upon it with pride, and if anybody starts, sniding it, why it brings out bristles in me, because I feel so strongly about that. And I feel strongly about that cause. And my final statement is, I think I'm very proud to be part of the greatest generation, according to Tom Brokaw.
Okay. Unless you have something.